Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description. The Devil Wears White. The ASL trio have been kidnapped, taken to a place that people only see in their nightmares. Children are tested on and lives are thrown away carelessly. How will they escape? If they do, who can they trust? And what's with these strange new powers? Now this is the season 1 of this fanfiction. It will have a season 2 where the same Luffy starts his adventure as from East Blue like in canon, but stronger and experienced. I don't own anything, adios.
After Garp stopped chasing Ace, he finished saying his goodbyes before he boarded his own ship, promising to visit again when he could. The brothers waved as he sailed off, much like they had done with Shanks, but this time, no one else was coming. They were going to be stuck with the whitebeard pirates for a while. What now? Ace asked when they finally finished waving. Sabou sighed. We can't get away with hiding away in our room all day anymore. We might as well stay out for a bit. Sabou responded reluctantly, glancing at their surroundings and noticing they were once again the center of the whitebeard pirates' attention. You'd think they'd know not to stare by now. Ace responded with a sour look as he continued glaring at everyone. Sabou sighed as the brothers turned and began walking off in a random direction. Curious people stare, Ace, it's just what they do, Sabou said as he took in their surroundings. Now that they knew they were going to be here a while, they should at least get used to the layout of the giant ship. Yeah, well, they shouldn't be so damn curious, Ace tapped, but even he was looking around to better orient himself. Luffy was glancing around as well, using his sense of smell so that he could place smells with objects or people. He was listening to his brothers tapping, following their silent conversation with ease even if he couldn't see it as he focused on a bundle of rope that smelled especially salty, probably having been in the ocean not too long ago. Looking around some more, he noticed a familiar sweet scent, turning to find that it was coming from Lady Not Lady, who was making their way towards them. He wasn't worried about the Lady Not Lady hurting him or his brothers. After all, they were projecting only calm and even happy feelings, and their color had been blue last time Luffy checked, so he focused more on their scent, doing his best to remember it. Izo. That's right, that was Lady Not Lady's name. Sabou's tap alerted Ace to the presence of the commander, and he tensed slightly before continuing to walk normally as if he didn't know the commander was there. Ace, Sabou, Luffy. Izo's words had the brothers stopping, Luffy peering up at his brothers, gauging their reactions. Sabou looked like he was steeling himself, taking a deep breath before smiling and turning to face the man, Ace turning as well, though the only thing he did was hold back a scowl, while Luffy turned timidly. He didn't know how to feel about Lady Not Lady. On one hand, they were nice, that much Luffy knew, and they hadn't done anything to hurt him or his brothers so far, and he had a good color and good feelings too, so that helped, but they didn't know much about him at all, and that was enough for Luffy to be cautious. Commander, Sabou said, nodding in greeting. Izo waved the word off. Call me Izo. Seeing as we're going to be shipmates for a while, there's no use keeping up formalities, Izo said, smiling once more. There was a bit of hesitance, but Sabou nodded nonetheless. Anyways, I just thought I'd come by and give you guys a better tour. We didn't think you would be staying with us that long, so Marco only showed you the important places, Izo said with a shrug. Do we have to? Ace tapped out, and Sabou could practically hear the whine. It would be helpful, Ace, besides, we were already going to look around. This way we'll actually know where we are. Sabou tapped back, Ace holding back a pout. Even though the eldest knew they were going to be there a long time, and he knew they would be seeing a lot of the pirates, that didn't mean he was volunteering to go spend time with them willingly. Lady Not Lady's nice. Luffy tapped simply, having been checking Izo's feelings as his brothers discussed what to do. Izo, Luffy, their name's Izo. Sabou corrected, not wanting Luffy to mention that nickname to the pirate in case they took offense to it. Thank you, Izo, that would be much appreciated, Sabou said with an easy smile. Izo nodded, moving to be in front of the brothers as he gestured to the area they were already in. Well, in that case, for starters, this is the way to the stern of the ship, Izo started, gesturing to the set of stairs in front of them, all of them beginning to make their way up them. As they moved along from one side of the deck to the next, Izo explained to them what each part of the ship was and what it did or what you could find there. This went on for a bit, the group even venturing a bit inside at one point. And over there is the helm, and over here is where everyone likes to do most of their fishing. Sabou took in everything Izo said, because he had no clue how long he and his brothers would be there, so any information was important information. We almost done? I want to take a nap, Ace said, and Sabou could see that the fiery teen's eyes were beginning to droop slightly. Even though he had gotten a good night's sleep on Shanks' ship, the eldest was still tired after having more than a few sleepless nights on the Moby. The stress hadn't helped either, along with his insomnia and narcolepsy, and Sabou was hoping that Ace wouldn't have an attack right now when they were surrounded by pirates on all sides. Well, we've seen the entire deck now, and a bit of the inside. I could ask Izo for a break for now, but we'd have to finish this later, Sabou said as he thought it all out. Ace suppressed a yawn, and Sabou knew they were going to have to cut this short. I'm sorry Izo, but seeing as the ship is so big, do you think we could continue this tour later? Shanks' party ran a little late last night and we're all a bit tired still. Sabou said apologetically, forcing a yawn, finding that it wasn't that hard to do so. Even he was feeling a bit tired, and by Luffy's slightly sluggish movements and lack of response during the conversation, he was tired as well. Seeing this, Izo nodded, smiling to the three. Of course, you three go take a nap, Izo said with a wave. Sabou responded with a wave of his own as he and his brothers turned toward their room. Thank you Izo, see you later, Sabou said, not waiting for a response as they walked away. The walk back was made in silence, the brothers ignoring any lingering stares from pirates who hadn't seen them since they got back from Garp's ship. They had only just closed the door to their room when Ace slumped to the ground, only slightly alarming Sabou and Luffy before they got over it, Sabou picking the hothead up and carrying him to the bed. Well, at least he had good timing, Sabou said as he finally laid Ace down, Luffy yawning loudly behind him. You should nap too Luffy, I'll stay up for a bit. Wait for the hothead to get up, Sabou said with a shrug as if it wasn't a big deal, and, really, it wasn't. Luffy looked at the blonde for a second before nodding, crawling into the bed beside Ace and curling up, enjoying the fact that Ace was practically a radiator. And that was how it was for the next few hours. Sabou sat at the desk, making patterns in the wood with his finger as he listened to the pirates, listening for anyone talking about them. People were more likely to speak their minds about someone when they didn't think that person was listening. A large number of pirates were mentioning the brothers, but nothing interesting or noteworthy, mostly just confusion, wondering what had happened in the facility or talking about the fact that they were related to Garp or knew Shanks. I barely even saw him today, but I heard Izo was giving him a tour. Really? I thought they would have been in their room? A mystery those three, I don't think we'll understand them even if we spend a whole year with them. Poor kids are already being hunted down by Marines. It never ceases to amaze me how low Marines will stoop to keep something quiet. Sabou recognized that last voice as being one of the commanders, though Sabou couldn't quite place which one of them it was. Fosa maybe? Or was it Atmos? Sabou hadn't been listening to any one conversation, instead, he was changing from one to another until he happened to hear the commander TLD listen in more. He noticed Ace's breathing begin to pick up, an indicator that he was waking up, from a nightmare no less. Getting up from the desk and stretching, Sabou made his way to the bed, already shaking Ace, careful not to wake Luffy as well. It only took a minute to get Ace out of his own nightmare, the eldest bolting upright and looking around frantically. It's fine Ace, we're in our room, Sabou said soothingly, watching the panic leave the eldest's eyes as he remembered where he was, recognizing his surroundings. He noticed Luffy sleeping beside him as Sabou began heading back to the desk chair. You had another attack so I had Luffy take a nap too. He seemed tired, and I guess you were too. It's been about 3 hours, Sabou said, taking note that dinner would be started soon. I think I woke up after my attack but I ended up going back to sleep. Ace mumbled as if he didn't quite know himself. Sabou raised an eyebrow at him. Huh, I didn't notice then, the blonde said, thinking back to the past few hours, not remembering the sound of Ace waking up. Really? What's got you so distracted? Ace asked, looking around the room as he spoke in a hushed tone. Sabou smiled, shaking his head. Nothing much, I was just listening to the pirates talk about us out there, Sabou said with a shrug. Ace frowned now. We're a hot topic then, huh? Ace asked, remembering back when Sabou would listen in on the doctors when they talked about the brothers. More like they have nothing more interesting to talk about. The only other thing they talk about is recent pirate attacks or where they're heading next. Apparently, it had been pretty quiet here until they found us, Sabou said with a sigh. The two fell silent after that, and it stayed that way for a few more minutes until Sabou noticed Luffy was starting to have another nightmare. Wake him up, Sabou said, nodding his head to Luffy. Ace frowned but nodded, knowing that meant the youngest was having a nightmare. All three of the brothers were plagued with nightmares nearly daily, every other day if they were lucky, but Luffy tended to have the worst nightmares of the three, enough to make him more resigned for even hours after having them. Ace was already shaking the youngest, whispering soothing things to calm him down, and within a few minutes the Raven was waking up in much the same way Ace had, bolting upright with panicked eyes that darted all around the room. It seemed he had had one of his worst nightmares if the sweat on his face and the wild look in his eyes were any indications. Sabou frowned as he once again stood from the chair and went to the bed, moving closer to help comfort the youngest with Ace. Hey, everything's okay Luffy, we're all okay, Sabou said soothingly, Ace nodding from where he sat. Yeah, we're fine, it was just another nightmare, Ace said in an equally calming voice, rubbing Luffy's back. Luffy rubbed his eyes, almost a little too hard, and shook his head, crawling out of the bed. Wanna go outside, Luffy mumbled, not even waiting for his brothers, which shocked them slightly. Even though the youngest had a nightmare, he was about to willingly go outside where there were tons of pirates, and he wasn't even waiting for Ace or Sabou. Whether the boy thought that the two would follow him anyways or he just didn't care, they didn't know, but either way Ace and Sabou scrambled out of the bed, rushing up to Luffy. Wait, Luffy, hold on, Sabou said, taking the littlest's hand in his, slowing his brother's fast pace before he could reach the door. "Yeah, Lu, you do know there are about a few hundred people out there, right? Are you sure you want to go out there right now?" Ace asked with a worried expression as he looked over Luffy, wondering if his brother was beginning to go crazy. Luffy merely frowned at his brothers, moving his free hand forward and grabbing the doorknob before they could protest anymore. Even though Sabou had a hold on Luffy's other hand, that didn't stop the rubberman from leaving the room, forcing Sabou to let go of his brother to keep from anyone seeing Luffy's arm stretching as he walked away. "Luffy!" Ace and Sabou hissed quietly as they ran after the youngest, barely remembering to close their door behind them. The straw-hatted boy didn't respond, continuing to walk briskly down the hallway and out onto the deck, ignoring any looks from the pirates as he moved to the railing and climbed onto it swiftly, taking off his hat and staring at the sea with a solemn expression. Ace and Sabou, who had followed the youngest, glanced at each other with worry, not having seen Luffy act like this before from a nightmare. Not wanting to cause a scene though, they resumed their normal positions, Ace sitting on the ground and keeping an eye out while Sabou joined their brother on the railing, also looking at the sea. It was around 5 in the evening now, the sky beginning to turn orange as it slowly got darker. The trio sat in silence, Ace and Sabou still thoroughly confused as to what was happening with Luffy and not knowing quite how to address it. The pirates seemed to notice the tenseness in the youngest and the worry in Ace and Sabou, many of them shooting them curious glances because of this, but all they could do was ignore it. "Luffy?" Sabou tried, deciding now was not a time to talk, especially with everyone around them listening in. Luffy gave no indication that he was going to respond, and Sabou was ready to leave it at that, but almost reluctantly Luffy responded, his taps slow and soft, almost too quiet for Ace to hear them. "Sorry." The two eldest frowned at this, Sabou bumping shoulders lightly with Luffy in an attempt to cheer the youngest up. "There's nothing to be sorry for, Lu, it's okay, you didn't do anything wrong," Sabou said, Ace nodding in agreement. Luffy frowned, shaking his head. "I worried Ace and Sabou, and I made you guys come out here even though I knew you two were nervous and scared and you didn't want to come out here, but I couldn't stay in there cause I couldn't breathe and it was small and stuffy and I wanted to see the ocean." And Sabou had to forcibly stop Luffy's ramblings, covering the teen's hand with his own. Luffy hesitated, realizing he had been tapping louder than he had meant, some pirates turning at the noise but shrugging it off once they realized what it was. "Sorry." Luffy tapped out again, much softer as he hung his head, still frowning. "Really, Lu, it's fine, Ace, and I understand. You had a nightmare and it messed you up a bit more than Ace and I thought it would. It's okay, it happens." Sabou tapped reassuringly. It went silent again as Sabou and Ace began sending warm pulses to Luffy, trying to show that they forgave him. He knew that Luffy could feel the sincerity coming from him, but sometimes the youngest would ignore those things when he was convinced of something otherwise. "Are you feeling better?" Sabou eventually asked after a few minutes. Slowly Luffy nodded, grabbing his hat off his head and twirling it in his fingers, a small smile blossoming on his face. "Yeah, Ace and Sabou are the best," Luffy responded, laughing quietly. Sabou laughed a bit as well, ruffling Luffy's hair fondly. "And don't you forget it." Ace spoke up, turning to look at Luffy as well. Luffy's smile widened as he looked back at Ace. Luffy hummed happily, any bad feelings from his nightmare gone now. Marco watched the brothers carefully from where he stood against one of the Moby's many masts. He, as well as many other brothers of his, had noticed the tenseness that was surrounding the brothers when they had re-emerged from their room after their nap. Worried that something had happened, Marco had decided to keep an eye on the three, debating whether he should go over and say anything or not. The brothers had been a mystery to everyone on the Moby ever since they had gotten there. Even to Marco. Even from the beginning, they were doing things that only raised more questions in the first mate's mind rather than answering anything. He remembered when the brothers had first gotten their own room, a fact had 2 separate beds, but after only a few hours the three had managed to somehow move the beds together despite the fact that they were bolted to the ground. Not only that, but there had been the time Sabou had abruptly shut the door in his face when he was getting them for a meal. At the time Marco kept a closer eye on them, thinking something was wrong, but they gave no indication that anything was out of the ordinary, so Marco decided not to question it. There was also the time the youngest, Luffy, had practically fainted during one of the meals after acting strangely and staring at Oyaji. No one had gotten any answers other than the boy was tired, but that didn't explain why the boy had been so interested in Oyaji or what he had been looking for before he had fainted. Even Whiskey couldn't find anything wrong, so once again, they were left with no other option but to move on and wonder about it privately, because they weren't going to get any answers from the brothers. Not only were the brothers mysterious in every sense of the word, but they also seemed to be resourceful when necessary. Before the pirates knew that they needed larger quantities of food, the brothers had done a good job at hiding that fact, not complaining in the slightest or giving any indication that they were still hungry. There was also the time that they had managed to cut their hair without anyone noticing, showing that, if they needed something, they wouldn't bother asking anyone for help finding it, they would just manage to do it themselves. Marco and Whitebeard had had many conversations in private about how puzzling the brothers were, but neither of them got any closer to figuring them out. Marco was pulled from his thoughts when he noticed Luffy was tapping his fingers against the railing loudly. He couldn't see the boy's face, but he could see the worried look that Sabou gave him, and after a few seconds of the loud rapping, Sabou stopped it, covering the youngest's hand with his own. Luffy froze up as if he hadn't realized he was tapping in the first place before he hung his head, but Marco didn't miss the minute movement of his fingers as he once again tapped against the railing, much quieter than he had before. The first commander narrowed his eyes at that, remembering how many times he'd seen the brothers tapping like that. Whether it was against their legs, on the table, or on a railing, the brothers seemed to have a habit of tapping. Marco wondered if it was a nervous habit or something they did unconsciously. The tension around the brothers increased for a second as Luffy hung his head, but within a few minutes the tension dissipated and Luffy was grabbing the hat off his head, smiling along with his brothers, Sabou ruffling the youngest's hair fondly while Ace seemed to say something that Luffy easily agreed to. Marco sighed, shaking his head as he smiled slightly, moving away from the mast to go join Whitebeard. Well, at least things on the Moby were going to be interesting for a while with those brothers around. After Luffy had cheered up, he no longer wanted to sit at the railing, wanting to explore the ship a bit. Ace and Sabou saw no harm in it. They were already surrounded by pirates. What difference would it make if they were on the other side of the deck instead of by the railing? They were trying to get used to being around large amounts of people, but it wasn't easy. Even though they were able to be near them, the feelings of discomfort and the anxiety they got didn't make it seem worth it. Luffy obviously felt the same but was still forcing himself to at least try and explore the ship. The three eventually moved away from the railing, slowly making their way through the many mingling pirates as they moved across the deck, using all of their senses to make sure no one got too close or tried hurting them. The three explored the areas they had seen on their tour with Izo, Luffy familiarizing himself with the smells associated with each spot before they would move on. They did this for a bit before they heard the bell that signaled it was dinner time. Everyone began filing towards the galley, but the brothers hung back at the stern of the ship, waiting for everyone to already be inside before they made their way there as well. Man, this crew is huge. Ace muttered as they watched the many crewmates playfully shoving and laughing together as they filed into the galley. It is the strongest man's crew, so really it's not all that surprising, Sabou said with a shrug as he watched all the pirates carefully. Lazy face is coming. Luffy tapped, having smelled the man ascending the opposite set of stairs, already spotting the odd haircut peeking around the corner as the man hunched slightly forward before straightening back up, making his way to the brothers. Told Thatch not to leave those stupid poles on the stairs, Yoi. The man muttered to himself, though the brothers were able to pick it up. Apparently, the man had tripped making his way up the stairs, explaining the hunch he had before. Hello there, First Commander. Sabou greeted with a smile, suppressing a laugh at the man's misfortune. Marco glanced over at the brothers, scanning over them quickly before nodding back in greeting. Just Marco is fine. What are you three doing here? Dinner's ready, Marco said with a raised eyebrow. Sabou smiled a bit to the man, shrugging. We thought we'd wait for it to get less crowded before we went, Sabou said, gesturing to the many pirates still trying to get into the room. Marco nodded, making a noise of understanding. What are you doing? Ace asked bluntly, slightly shocking the man with the fact that he had spoken. He recovered quickly though, responding with a slight hint of frustration. Well, it seems Thatch forgot something up here that he wanted me to get him, Yoi. He also forgot to pick up his fishing poles too, Marco said, sending a glare to the objects that were out of sight. What did he forget? Luffy asked a bit timidly. Marco was once again surprised, because as rare as it was to hear Ace talk, it was even rarer to hear Luffy talk. Once again though, he got over it. His lighter. Apparently, it fell out of his pocket when he was messing around with Haruta and he's stuck in the kitchen, so I told him I'd get it for him, Yoi. Marco explained, glancing around for the item, though having no clue where to start looking. Even though he knew it was in the area, it was still a large section to search for such a tiny item, and he had a feeling it would take longer than he would like to find it. Luffy, however, remembered what the lighter looked like, remembering how, when they were escaping, Thatch had used it to light up the dark hallways for them. Luffy took only a second to try remembering the smell before he discreetly sniffed the air, finding the familiar scent in the air. Oh, I know where it is, Luffy said with a smile, Marco turning to look at him with a raised eyebrow. Really? That would make things much easier, Yoi, Marco said. Ace and Sabou turned to look at Luffy, slightly confused. The brothers hadn't moved much up here, and if Luffy had found the object he most likely would have pointed it out to the brothers, so how did Luffy know where it was? Despite this, Luffy began walking away, everyone following as he moved towards the smaller set of stairs that led even higher up the stern. Beside the stairs was a bundle of rope, coiled together, but Luffy stuck his hand into the middle, pulling out the lighter with ease, turning to hand it to the commander with a smile. Thank you, Luffy, Yoi. How did you know it was there? Marco asked, curious as he took the object from Luffy. The youngest looked a bit nervous for a second before Sabou interrupted. Is that what you were talking about when you said you thought you saw something shiny in the rope? Sabou asked, easily supplying the lie for Luffy. Knowing his brother couldn't lie to save his life. Grateful, Luffy grinned, nodding. I remembered it, Luffy agreed. Well, thank you again. I think I would have been her if you hadn't seen it, Marco said gratefully. No problem, Laz. Oh look, it seems things have finally settled down. Come on Luffy, let's go eat. Sabou interrupted, hearing Luffy beginning to say his signature nickname for the first commander. Even though the man hadn't seemed to mind too much the first time he heard Luffy say it, he didn't want to push it by letting Luffy say it more and more. He was really going to have to start teaching the youngest everyone's names. Yeah, come on Lu, Sabou, and I'll eat everything if you don't hurry, Ace added, starting to walk away for dramatic effect. Luffy's eyes widened as he glanced from Marco to his now retreating brothers. Gotta go, Ace, Sabou. Don't eat without me, Marco laughed as he watched the youngest run off after his brothers, feeling as if he had just witnessed something special. The brothers had almost seemed relaxed around him, even though Marco could still tell they were on edge when speaking with him. The first mate looked to the lighter in his hand, twirling it around. He did find it odd how the straw-hatted boy had found the object so easily, almost as if he had put it there himself. And the oddly nervous look the boy had when Marco questioned him confused him even more. Why would he be nervous answering such an easy question? Sabou had seemed to save the boy from answering though, and that only confused Marco more. The brothers were definitely a strange trio. Did you see Thatch's fishing poles on the stairs? Marco's sure gonna talk his ear off for that one. Curiel said with a laugh. The brothers were in the galley, eating their food quietly, listening in on the conversation as they resumed their normal positions, Ace and Luffy on guard while Sabou did any talking necessary. Yeah, he's been telling him for weeks to move those things. When do you think he'll finally do it? Jiru asked. Haruta laughed quietly, confusing the commanders. Hopefully not for another week if I can help it, Haruta said casually, taking another bite of his food. What are you talking about? Atmos asked, completely lost. Haruta shrugged. I've given myself a little game. Since things started getting boring now that we're back in paradise, I had to find new ways to get entertainment, Haruta said. And how does that involve Thatch not putting away his fishing poles? Rikuyo asked. It's simple, every time Thatch looks like he's gonna put him away I distract him. My goal had been a week in the beginning, but now we're so close to a month of them being there that I can't quit now, Haruta explained with determination. The commanders burst out into laughter, Haruta smiling proudly. Well, in that case, good luck. Let's just hope Marco doesn't find out you're the reason that those things are still there. You'll probably end up with watch duty and clean up for double the amount of time that they've been there, Jozu said, patting Haruta on the back. It's the risk that makes it even more fun, Haruta said before continuing with his meal. The commanders laughing once more before the doors opened, Whitebeard entering and sitting in his usual spot. Hey there Pops, have you heard about Haruta's new game? Flamenco asked, beginning to slip up at Haruta's name before remembering the brothers sitting quietly at the table. Whitebeard raised an eyebrow, about to question Flamenco about said game, but Haruta began shushing them. Shush, shush, here comes Marco, Haruta said in a rushed whisper, trying to look casual as he began eating his food, though it was too forced and only made him look a bit suspicious. Once again the commanders began laughing, but Marco didn't question it, only sitting down in his usual spot and beginning his meal as well. Hey, Marco, where have you been? Kingdu asked, completely unfazed by the previous conversation. Marco pulled out Thatch's lighter, showing the table. I went to look for Thatch's lighter for him, even though the damn idiot left his fishing poles out again. It was obvious to the brothers, Marco, and Whitebeard that some of the commanders were trying to hold back laughter, Haruta sending them all glares, but Izo was composed enough to speak. So, you found it? That was fast. I'm surprised no one else found it first then, Izo said, thinking that if anyone saw the lighter on the ground they would notice and take it to the chef, or even Whitebeard. Marco shook his head. I didn't find it, Yoi, Luffy did, Marco said, moving his head to gesture to Luffy who was eating quietly. The commanders looked to the boy with curious expressions. Really, good job kid, Vista said, smiling to Luffy who shifted a bit, obviously nervous with all the attention directed his way. Where was it anyways? Nomura asked, the attention leaving Luffy at the question and turning back to Marco. In the rope, we had up there, Yoi, Marco responded, confusing the commanders. How'd you they're gone. Well, Marco, how do you know it was there? Flamenco asked, noticing the brothers had once again run away leaving empty plates behind. Marco merely responded with a shrug. Beats me, the kid found it the second I mentioned it though. When I asked him about it he got nervous and Sabou interrupted, Yoi. Apparently, he had seen it when they were up there earlier, Marco said, causing a few of them to frown. A tiny lighter in a bundle of ropes? Kid must have some damn good eyesight then if that's the case, Curiel said, some nodding in agreement. Oh, hey you three, you done with dinner already? The brothers were stopped on their way to their room by Thatch who had just walked out as well. The brothers hesitated, not having expected anyone to stop them. Normally they could get to their room without issue after meal times. "Ah, yeah, we actually just finished. What are you doing?" Sabou asked, curious seeing as Thatch had been in the kitchen the entire time, not even coming out to say hi like normal, probably busy. Thatch sighed, looking off towards the stern. "Well, I've been getting a bit distracted lately every time I go to pick those fishing poles up, and if I forget any more Marco's gonna have my hide, so I'm gonna go pick him up before I eat," Thatch said, causing the brothers to remember the game Haruta had been playing. Luffy looked like he wanted to say something, probably spill the beans about Haruta, but Ace placed a hand on his brother's mouth, stopping him. "Oh, well, Ruta was looking for you. He said it was important," Ace said with a mischievous glint in his eye, Sabou smiling a bit at that and nodding. "Really, I shouldn't keep him waiting then, but this should only take a second," Thatch said, seemingly debating what he should do first. "He mentioned something about your lighter too," Sabou said, putting on a look as if he was thinking back to this imaginary conversation. "My lighter? Maybe he found it?" Thatch asked, more to himself as he turned to the galley doors, already walking towards them. "Thanks, guys, I'll see you later," Thatch said, entering the galley, fishing poles forgotten. Sabou and Ace snickered, Luffy watching with confusion, having felt his brother's feelings of deceptiveness and mischief, confused as to why they were lying to the nice chef. He followed them back to their room regardless, though he didn't try to hide his confused expression. "Why do you lie to Mr. Chef? He's nice," Luffy said with a bit of a pout. Still smiling, Sabou ruffled Luffy's hair. "Ace and I were just playing a bit of a joke on him. Remember how Ruta mentioned he was playing a game with Mr. Chef?" Sabou asked, Luffy nodding with a perplexed expression on his face. "We were just helping him win," Ace said with a shrug, also smiling. Understanding flashed across Luffy's face at this. "Oh, I get it," Luffy said cheerily, his brothers shaking their heads at Luffy's simple thoughts. "So how did you know that the chef's lighter was in the ropes?" Ace asked, still curious about it. Luffy beamed, clearly pleased with himself. "I remembered it from when he helped us escape, so I smelled for it and found it in the ropes. Its smell made me hungry, but it also smells like fire too," Luffy said, tacking on the last bit as more of an afterthought. Understanding showed on Ace and Sabou's faces now, wondering how they hadn't thought about that first. "Well, be careful when you do that. You helped, which is good, but you can't lie, so when someone questions you about it you could end up giving yourself away, Lou," Sabou said, not in a chastising tone, but more of a tone of worry, not wanting his brother's abilities to be found out. Luffy seemed to understand the weight of Sabou's words, nodding. "We should probably teach you how to lie better, or else Sabou's gonna have to save you every time," Ace said, folding his hands behind his head and laying down on the bed. "But lying's bad," Luffy said, remembering all the doctors who would lie to them, tell them that the shots wouldn't hurt, that they wouldn't feel a thing, that the medicine was helping them. The youngest shivered, his brothers noticing. "Yes, lying can be bad, but sometimes, like when we had to lie about how you found the lighter, it's helpful," Sabou explained. Luffy slowly nodding in understanding. Sabou sighed. "Well, if we're doing this, the first step, lying doesn't always have to be false information. Maybe if you add a bit of truth in your words it'll be easier." Sabou, per usual, was the first of the three to wake up the next day. Normally when it came to the Moby, one of the many pirates would walk by and wake the blonde up, but this time it wasn't a pirate, it was Luffy. His heavy breathing and rapidly beating heart tuned him into the fact that Luffy was once again having a nightmare. It seemed the youngest's nightmares were getting worse and worse with each passing day. Sighing, Sabou sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes and shaking the youngest, trying to rouse him from his slumber. Luffy was in between Ace and Sabou, so when the blonde began shaking Luffy he pushed him into Ace, slowly waking the fiery teen as well. "What's going on?" Ace mumbled, his eyebrows scrunching together as he sat up groggily, looking around. "Lou's having a nightmare," Sabou responded, yawning. It was earlier than they would normally get up, still dark out, which indicated it was either late at night or early in the morning. Sabou focused his attention back on his brother, shaking him again and speaking softly to him while Ace tried to wake up enough to help. It took a few minutes this time, to the point where Sabou was beginning to think Luffy might be stuck in his nightmare, but with a start, Luffy woke up. He didn't bolt up like before, but his eyes shot open in panic and he began breathing heavier, flickering his eyes around in confusion. "Everything's okay, Lou, just a nightmare," Ace said, very obviously still tired if the slight slur was anything to go on. Luffy sat up, trying to calm his breathing back down as Ace and Sabou sent him warm feelings, hoping to calm him down. "Do you want to go outside?" Sabou asked softly, knowing that had helped him last time, but this time Luffy shook his head, laying back down and burying his face in his pillow. Ace and Sabou looked at each other before slowly laying back down as well. "You want to talk about it?" Ace asked quietly. None of them had shared what they dreamt about, because they already knew what the nightmares were about, but Ace wanted to help the youngest in any way he could. Luffy shook his head though, curling into a tight ball and pulling the blankets up closer to him and forcing himself to try to go back to bed. The nightmare had been a pretty bad one, worse than the night before, but Luffy was still tired and he didn't want to bother Ace and Sabou by forcing them to go outside again, especially not this early, or late. Luffy wasn't sure, in the day. Instead, the boy decided that he would just try and calm down and fall asleep, hoping that the feeling of Ace and Sabou at his side would help him. He could tell that they were worried, he could feel it after all, and he tried ignoring those feelings, instead focusing on the warmth they were sending him, the love, the happiness. He basked in the feelings and allowed them to slowly calm him down. He could tell when they fell asleep not too long after because their feelings became dulled slightly, almost non-existent except for a small hint of a stronger emotion depending on the type of dream they were having. Luffy turned so he was on his back and looked at the air in front of him, allowing himself to see Ace and Sabou's waves that were still visible, even in the dark of the room. He hadn't needed to look at his brother's waves in a while, but seeing them now was comforting. The fact that he couldn't see through them at all now also comforted him, showing that both of his brothers were in good health, completely healed up after everything that had happened. The youngest smiled slightly as he reached his hand up to swipe at the waves. Though his hand merely passed right through them, the air not feeling any different, not that he expected it to. After staring at the waves a bit longer, Luffy turned onto his side once more, closing his eyes with a smile on his face, his nightmare forgotten. Ace and Sabou would keep him safe, even from his own nightmares. The next time the brothers were waking up it was because it was breakfast time. Due to the wake-up call in the middle of the night, they weren't feeling all that refreshed, but it was nothing new to them so they got up and made their way to the galley. Ace's glares were just a hint harsher than normal, his mood a bit sour from the lack of sleep, and Luffy was even more timid than usual, clinging to Ace and Sabou as if it was his first time seeing the pirates. Sabou wasn't faring much better either, his normally easy-to-force smiles now much harder to conjure up as he greeted overly chatty pirates trying to stop them for a conversation. Apparently, now that the brothers were going to be here longer than anyone expected, that meant everyone wanted to try being their friends. Every time they turned a corner there would be a different person trying to start up a conversation with them, but Sabou would just smile and politely inform them that they were heading to the galley and that they would talk later. "I wish everyone would leave us alone." Ace tapped, clearly irritated by everyone prying into the brothers' lives. Sabou sighed but felt himself feeling the same way. "They're just trying to be friendly, Ace, though they could be a little less." Sabou trailed off, trying to find the right word. "Annoying," Ace supplied as he glared rather harshly toward someone who was seemingly making their way towards them. "I was going to say eager," Sabou said with an eye roll. Ace huffed at that but didn't say anything more. Luffy had been listening to their tapping silently, gripping tightly onto their hands and staring at the ground. Even though he had felt happy when he went to sleep, he had woken up and immediately remembered his nightmare from last night, which made him remember the facility, which made him remember all the horrible feelings he had felt when he was there. Even though he knew these pirates weren't going to hurt them, at least not unless they were provoked, he still had an inkling of a feeling that, at any moment, someone would grab them and strap them to chairs. He shivered at the thought, staring even harder at the ground as they walked. His brothers seemed to notice his shiver because he could feel the worry coming off of them, quickly replaced with warmth and love, the two feelings mingling together to put Luffy at ease. When they finally reached the galley it was like a safe haven, because everyone in here was too preoccupied with their food to bother talking to them. Well, everyone except for the commanders. Sitting in their usual spot, Sabou noticed that everyone was there now, even the captain. As they ate breakfast their moods slowly started evening out. Ace's glare softened back to how it normally was. Luffy wasn't clinging as tightly as before, and Sabou didn't feel so overwhelmed. Luckily the commanders or captain hadn't pulled any of them into a conversation, either because they noticed the brothers' moods or just because of chance, but as they were finishing up and getting leave the change. They had just stood up from the table, ready to slip away without anyone noticing, but Haruta had other plans. Seeing the brothers walking away the commander quickly shoveled some food in his mouth, uttering a quick, "Be right back," before chasing after the trio who were now leaving the galley, the doors swinging closed behind them. "Hey, wait!" Haruta's shout had the brothers pausing as they saw the commander run out of the galley, smiling brightly to them. The brothers immediately tensed, wondering what was happening but waiting for the commander to speak before they did anything. "Can we just ignore him?" Sabou shook his head a bit at Ace's taps, feeling Luffy grab onto his hand, noticing he had grabbed Ace's as well. "No Ace, that would just be rude, we're not trying to make them hate us," Sabou responded, squeezing Luffy's hand a bit in an attempt at comforting the boy. The youngest had just gotten over his nightmare from last night and this was not helping. "Doesn't feel bad, feels happy." Luffy tapped to his brothers, noticing no ill feelings coming from Haruta as he made his way over to the three, only joy, Sabou-tun. "Commander, what do you need?" the blonde asked with a polite tone, though his body expression gave way to the tenseness he felt. Haruta continued smiling. "Well, I wanted to thank you guys," Haruta said cheerily, confusing the trio. "For what?" Sabou asked, having no idea what Haruta would be thanking them for. The man's grin widened though as he explained. "For yesterday. I totally would have lost my game if you hadn't distracted Thatch for me, so thanks," Haruta said, and Luffy decided he liked the man, having felt only pure, happy feelings from him. Understanding now what Haruto was talking about, Ace and Sabo both relaxed, smiling a bit as well as they remembered. It was no big deal, we just overheard you telling the other commanders about it and thought you would like to keep the game going, Sabo said, shrugging it off. Haruto laughed now, nodding. Yeah, it would be no fun if it stopped now. Anyways, thanks again, maybe I'll see you guys later. Oh, and you can call me H. Wait. No, Ruda. You can call me Ruda. Commander's too formal. Haruto said, already waving and walking away as he spoke, leaving no time for a response. The trio watched him walk off before they began walking as well. The deck was nearly clear of any pirates, all of them still in the galley eating breakfast, but that didn't mean that no one was out there. Sabo knew for a fact that there were people in the crow's nests. He could hear them muttering to themselves or shuffling around, and there was a handful of people who had already finished their meal, lounging around on the deck. Can we sit on the rail? Luffy asked, already looking towards their usual spot. Sabo looked at Ace, and when he nodded, Sabo changed their direction to the railing. Sure Lu, Sabo answered, the three of them quickly reaching the railing and assuming their normal positions. They sat in silence, as usual, none of them finding any reason to speak. It was another beautiful day, and Sabo had to wonder when the weather would change because from what he remembered reading, Grand Line weather was never predictable and could change in a second. Time passed quickly, and sitting, staring at the ocean, gave the brothers a good excuse not to talk to anyone, especially Ace, seeing as he was pretending to be asleep. Unfortunately, this didn't mean others were deterred from wanting to talk to them, and by the time breakfast was over the brothers were, per the usual, the center of attention, everyone practically buzzing around them. Sabo could hear their quiet chatter, many of them wanting to approach, but no one doing so. It was a bit irritating and it made all of them twitch nervously at the feeling of everyone's eyes on them, but that didn't stop them from trying to at least enjoy their time there. It was strange because Sabo could remember not all that long ago when the three of them could barely leave their room without being on the edge of a panic attack, but now they were able to sit out on deck with, almost, no issue. They were still nowhere near ready to go walking and talking with these pirates, but it was already a dramatic change to how they had been when they first got there. It definitely helped that Luffy had yet to feel the darkness or see even a hint of gray around anyone. Marco, Sabo began turning around at Ace's tap, ready to greet the commander. Luffy continued facing the ocean, but he turned his head so he could watch Marco as well, taking note of his feelings, searching for anything bad. No bad feelings, Luffy informed, relaxing Sabo a bit. Hello there Marco, Sabo said with a smile. Luffy sending the man one of his own while Ace continued to pretend he was asleep. Marco nodded back in greeting, going into his normal position for whenever he talked to the brothers by the railing. Did you want to talk about something? Sabo asked, swinging his legs slightly to give a carefree air around him, even if he wasn't feeling that carefree at the moment. Luffy was swinging his legs as well, but he had been doing that the entire time, even before Marco had gotten there. Yes, actually, Oyaji and I were just discussing living arrangements, seeing as you three are staying much longer than we had first anticipated, Yoi. Marco said, Sabo, nodding in understanding. Of course, this was going to have to come up sometime. The pirates hadn't been fully prepared to take in three teenagers who had serious issues, whether they knew about those issues or not. Of course. And, Sabo asked, wondering where this conversation was going to go. Right before Marco responded though, Sabo heard the faintest tap from Ace, drawing his attention to the fiery teen, though he kept his eyes locked on Marco. Sleep attack. And just like that, Ace's body slumped down ever so slightly, breathing evening out. Sabo's lips pursed slightly, but if there was ever a time for Ace to have an attack on deck, at least it was when everyone already thought he was sleeping. Ace fell asleep. Sabo tapped covertly to Luffy, the boy nodding minutely back as he focused more on making sure no one got too close to Ace now. Well, seeing as we thought you three would only be here a few days, we weren't equipped with clothing, shoes, or any other things you would need, so we'll need to stock up on the next island for you, Yoi. Marco started, Sabo nodding along as he kept his guard up, now extra tense seeing as Ace was down for the count. All he could do was hope that Ace wouldn't have a nightmare. Also, if you three would like separate rooms, we can arrange that, Marco said, and even though Sabo knew they were just trying to be accommodating, he still felt a pulse of anger at the words, but kept calm on the outside, shaking his head. No, it's fine, we'll continue sharing. Was there anything else? Sabo asked, wanting to move on. Marco nodded, continuing. Yes, seeing as you're not a part of the crew, we don't expect you to do anything like fighting or taking watch. But seeing as you'll be here indefinitely, we decided that you should at least do some sort of chores like washing dishes, Yoi, Marco explained. Sabo continuing to nod, keeping a close ear on Ace's breathing. Of course, we expected to have to do at least that much, Sabo replied, because they had. No pirate was going to take on three teens for free and let them laze around forever. It was at this point that Sabo heard Ace's breathing picking back up, and he nearly sighed in relief, noticing that the teen wasn't having a nightmare, rather he was waking up. Before Ace could panic about where he was or what was happening, Luffy began tapping to him, telling him that they were still talking to Lazy Face, and seriously, Sabo had to stop that nickname. Anything else? Sabo asked, wanting to go back to relaxing so he could catch Ace up. Marco sighed. Well, there's one more thing, Yoi. Marco started, a bit hesitant. Sabou raised an eyebrow at that, wondering what Marco was about to say. Clearly, it was something that the man knew they weren't going to like hearing, but what that was, he had no idea. Sensing the hesitance, Ace and Luffy tensed up, not knowing what to expect but knowing it probably wasn't going to be good. What is it? Sabou asked in as evenly a voice as possible. Marco sighed before he responded. We know that you all have a strong disliking for doctors, Yoi. The brothers involuntarily shivered at that but waited for Marco to continue. But seeing as you're going to be staying here, it would be their job to help you if any of you got hurt. Because of that, Whiskey just wants to get a bit of simple information. Just enough to know if she should avoid certain procedures if she has to, Yoi. Marco explained, watching the brothers carefully for their reaction. The commander knew of the brothers' near phobia of doctors, but this information was necessary so that Whiskey would be able to better perform her job if needed. Marco also knew that the brothers weren't very giving when it came to information about themselves, so Marco knew that this was going to be a task. No hell no, Ace tapped out, still a bit groggy from his enough to know exactly what was happening. We can't exactly deny, Sabou replied, feeling a bit panicked at the corner they were in. Marco hadn't exactly been asking, more like telling the brothers that they had to do this, something none of them wanted to do at all. Don't want to talk to the doctors. Luffy said, fear in his eyes as he turned to face the ocean, hiding his expression from the onlooking commander. I know Lu, but there's nothing I can tell him without possibly making him mad. Sabou said, feeling fear himself. Then make him mad, we're not talking to no doctor, Ace responded. A scowl quickly making its way onto his face at the thought. We can't just make him mad, Ace, we're going to be staying here for a while, remember? We can't have them already hating us. Sabou tapped back urgently, trying to keep it discreet and quiet enough that Marco wouldn't think much of it, but loud enough that Ace could hear it without seeing it. He's worried. Luffy butted in, sensing the worry rolling off the commander as he watched the brothers, his face not changing from his neutral expression. Of course he's worried his plan will fail, Ace tapped back. And what plan would that be, Ace? Sabou asked, nearly frowning. The plan where he gets on our good side and then stabs us in the back, Ace replied, anger beginning to form in both the eldest brothers. Luffy started swinging his feet faster, worried that this was going to turn out worse than he would like. He didn't want to talk to any doctor, but he didn't want Ace and Sabou fighting either. He didn't know which one was worse. Luffy did his best to block the anger from entering him, but the only other feeling he could focus on was the worry coming from Marco, and that wasn't helping either. Maybe he should try and feel the giant captain's feelings and hope for the warmth, but he didn't know where he was, not having seen him leave the galley after breakfast and not seeing him in his chair. His feet began moving even faster than before as the nervous energy built up within him. If we speak to her, can we do it out here? On the deck, Sabou asked, trying to find a compromise that would put them at least a bit at ease. None of the brothers would want to go into the infirmary where they would just be bombarded with horrible memories and smells, but they also didn't want to talk to Whiskey in the first place. Sabou. The anger was rising within Ace and it was becoming harder and harder for Luffy to ignore it. If that's what you would prefer, I'm sure she wouldn't mind, Marco said, a bit of his worry disappearing at what sounded like an agreement to talk to Whiskey. We're not talking. Ace's taps were sharp and deliberate, but Sabou ignored them anyway, putting Luffy more on edge as he swallowed, glancing between his brothers nervously, not even bothered if Marco was watching or not. Then we'll answer to the best of our ability, Sabou said, but it came out almost forced, like he didn't want to be saying it at all, which he didn't. Ace had to hold back a shout of outrage at that moment, ready to wring Sabou's neck for agreeing so easily. Was that blonde idiot insane? He was going to willingly give their information over to a doctor? A rational part of the fiery team's brain told him that it wouldn't be as bad as he was thinking it would be, that he should trust Sabou in what he was doing. But all he could think about was the facility and how every single doctor there had hurt them every day just so they could get information about them. What if Whiskey heard something and wanted to know more about it? Would she start doing tests on them? Would she have the pirates hold them down while she injected them with who knew what? That's good to hear, Yoi. Do you want to do it right now? Marco asked, slightly surprised that Sabou had agreed at all. Sabou hesitated, knowing he was pushing the limit on Ace's anger. I think that would be best, Sabou said, Marco nodding, saying he would go get the nurse before walking away. Ace didn't even attempt to hide that he was awake anymore, opening his eyes and spinning a glare onto Sabou, who gave a sheepish smile back. Sabou, what the hell? Ace tapped out, clearly furious. As much as the hothead wanted to scream at the blonde, he held back, not wanting to draw any more unwanted attention to themselves. Ace, just listen. Listen, Sabou, you just agreed to talk to a doctor. Giving our information to a doctor? Ace tapped with such speed and intensity that Sabou and Luffy almost couldn't understand it. Yes, but what if they end up hearing something they want to know more about? Who's to say they won't strap us down and start testing on us here? Ace continued, not listening to anything Sabou was trying to say. Luffy knew it was going to happen. knew that all of Ace's anger would flow into him, but he had been trying so hard to stop it. Ace, this was a horrible idea. I should have never agreed to stay with these bastards. Ace wasn't stopping for a second in his rant, glare still plastered on his face as he looked at Sabou. Luffy was watching with worry, feeling the anger slowly taking hold. Calm down, Sabou finally got out, doing what he had done to Luffy by placing his hand on top of Ace's, stopping any more taps from the eldest. Ace's glare hardened at that, and it was obvious he wanted to continue talking, probably yell at Sabou for even suggesting he calm down. You're going to get Luffy mad. Do you want him charging off again? When there's a doctor on her way here to talk to us right now? Sabou asked, sending Ace a stern look, gesturing to Luffy, who was slowly going from nervous to angry, his features morphing into a glare as he stared at the sea. The sight made Ace's anger fizzle out, realizing what was happening. Even though they had promised they would listen to each other to stop from influencing Luffy, he had gone and done the exact opposite. Sorry, Lou. Ace finally tapped remorsefully, placing a hand on Luffy's shoulder. The anger slowly dissipated from Luffy now, the nervousness returning at once as the straw-hatted boy noticed what had nearly happened, and what was going to happen. Ace, I know you don't like it, Sabou started, Ace scoffing quietly. What gave you the clue? Ace asked, causing Sabou to roll his eyes, but continued nonetheless. But we have to. We can't exactly avoid it forever, and remember, you were the one saying we don't want them turning on us, Sabou said, this time causing Ace to roll his eyes. Yeah, I also said we weren't going to tell them anything about our powers or the facility, Ace countered. And we won't, we're just going to tell them harmless information, and if they start asking something too personal, I won't answer. Don't worry, you don't even have to look at the doctor if you don't want to, Sabou said, knowing that even the sight would put them all on edge. Ace glared a bit at that though, crossing his arms. And let her stab you with a needle? No thanks. You do the talking, I'll do the watching, Ace said, causing Sabou to grin, realizing Ace was finally becoming at least accepting that this was going to happen. Luffy felt some of his nervousness disappear at the fact that his brothers were getting along again, but any relief he felt quickly disappeared as he smelled the familiar burning stench of a doctor walking out onto the deck. With the salty air and everyone else's smells, the doctor's scent wasn't as overwhelming as normal, but it was still enough for Luffy to feel a bit of a headache. Doctor's here. Luffy tapped hesitantly, keeping his eyes locked firmly in front of him, watching the horizon. He didn't want to see the doctor, didn't want to remember everything that had happened at the facility. Ace and Sabou placed their hands on his shoulders. Don't worry, Lou, you don't have to say or do anything, Ace and I will take care of everything, Sabou tapped, noticing the nervous tension rising in the youngest. Luffy only responded with a nod, not saying anything else as they waited for Marco and the nurse to reach them. Hello there boys, I'm to speak with me, Whiskey said with a smile, and Sabou knew she was trying to keep them calm, but everything she did had the opposite effect. The smile morphed in Ace and Sabou's minds to be a devilish grin, the happiness in her voice turning sickly sweet, hiding her ulterior motives, the carefree way she moved, holding her clipboard becoming much more menacing to them. There was a collective shiver from all three of the brothers, even Luffy who wasn't even looking. Just the smell and sound of the nurse was enough to unnerve him. Regardless, Sabou swallowed thickly, forcing a smile onto his face as he shifted a bit on the railing. He still didn't feel up to speaking yet, even though that was all he was going to be doing, so he just nodded to the nurse, hoping she would continue on. I just need a bit of simple information, nothing too complicating. If you can't answer something, that's fine, just try your best, she said, still keeping the chipper attitude. Sabou nodded again, still trying to find his voice. Ace, who was still standing, had his eyes narrowed, watching every minute movement the nurse was making, just waiting for her to grab a needle. Would you like Marco to leave? Normally we do this in my office where no one can listen in, doctor-patient confidentiality and all, Whiskey said, and Ace tilted his head a bit at that, having never heard the term before. Well, he also hadn't ever seen a doctor before the facility, unless Magra counted as a doctor, which, in his mind, he didn't. A doctor can't give away anything we tell them, they have to keep it secret, Sabou informed Ace, having read about it before. Ace nearly scoffed, remembering the facility where their information was thrown around without care. It's fine, he can stay, Sabou said, taking into account that Luffy had deemed Marco a nice person in both feelings and color. If after hearing this his color started turning gray, then the brothers would know that they should probably leave the ship. If just a bit of information on the brothers had the first mate turning gray, then what did that say about everyone else? Alright, then let's get started, we'll start off simple. Do you three have any allergies? Anything we should avoid? She asked, holding her clipboard up, ready to take notes. Sabou shook his head, finally finding his voice. No, nothing we know of, he said. Whiskey nodded, writing stuff down before looking back up. Before the facility, did you three see a regular doctor? She asked, Sabou, answering with another no. Even though he had been born into nobility, he had only gone to a doctor a few times before he ran away. It wasn't exactly something you would call regular. Whiskey nodded, writing that down. Do any of you have a pre-existing medical condition that I should know about? She asked, causing Sabou to hesitate a bit at that. He had already pushed Ace into allowing this conversation, and if he gave away the fact that he had narcolepsy to the nurse, he was sure Ace would go ballistic. Not that he wanted to tell the doctor in the first place, he was just worried that the nurse would find out and get mad that he had lied. No, Sabou said simply, not trusting himself to say any more than that. Whiskey bought it as easily as the other answers, and Sabou practically sighed in relief, seeing Ace, who had tensed at the question, relax a bit as well, clearly having been worried about the same thing as him. Any medication that you three used before that you would need, Whiskey continued, to which Sabou was able to answer much easier, giving another no. The rest of the questions were much easier to answer, their height, an estimate on their weight, did anyone in their family have any medical issues that might show up in them later. Of course, she had assumed that they had the same parents, but either way, Sabou answered a no on that one. They didn't know much about Luffy's parents, and his own hadn't had any issues. Sabou decided it was best not to mention Ace's parents either. Well, that seems to be about it. Thank you three for answering, Whiskey said, smiling once more to the brothers. Colors? Sabou grabbed Luffy's attention with the tap, and even though Luffy did not want to look at the doctor, he still forced himself to at least glance, focusing more on the colors surrounding the person rather than the person itself. Blue, no gray. Ace and Sabou practically sighed in relief at the answer, both of them relaxing a bit. It was no problem, Mrs. Nurse, I'm glad we could help, Sabou said, able to force a smile easier knowing that the nurse would be leaving any second. Please, Whiskey is just fine, she said calmly, Sabou nodding, though he didn't plan on talking to her again anytime soon. With that, Whiskey was finally walking away, any tension the brothers had leaving as she disappeared into the depths of the Moby. Now that that's over, lunch should be ready soon. We can head in there now if you want, Yoi, Marco suggested, nodding towards the galley. Sabou glanced at Ace and Luffy, both of them nodding in response. That would be nice, thank you, Marco, Sabou said, standing and smoothing out his clothes as Luffy got off the railing as well, Ace stretching a bit. Marco nodded and began walking to the galley, and Sabou had to take a second to realize that they felt more relaxed around Marco than anyone else here. Maybe it was because the man didn't show any outward interest in the brothers? Everyone else was always staring at them, always talking about them when they thought they couldn't hear. But Marco never did any of that unless he was discussing accommodations for the brothers. He didn't ogle the brothers like they were sideshow attractions, and he didn't force them into anything they didn't want to do, besides the whole answer and nurses questions thing. Sabou shrugged this off and began following the commander, his brothers close at his side as he did. No matter how relaxed he felt around the man, he still wasn't all that trusting of him. The possibility that he was just trying to get on their good side was still there, and not to mention, it only took one wrong thought to change a clear blue aura to gray. The brothers and Marco made their way to the galley, only a few people in there, and Marco went to the kitchen, telling the brothers he would be right back. Izo was the only one sitting at the commander's table, so the brothers didn't feel all that nervous when they went to sit down. Izo greeted the three with a smile, one that Sabou returned, before they returned to silence, Izo working on something in his lap. The four sat in silence, but seeing as there was no one to be worried about, Ace and Luffy were much more relaxed than normal, not needing to keep their guard up as much. Because of this, Luffy was becoming more and more interested in what Izo was working on, smelling something that he recognized to belong to the commander with the cool mustache. Nay, what's lady not lady doing? Luffy asked, trying not to stare so he didn't draw the mont's attention, but still extremely curious. Ace and Sabou looked at Luffy for a second before turning their attention to Izo, though they were unable to see whatever it was seeing as the man was sitting on the other side of the table. I don't know, Lou, I can't see, Sabou said, causing Luffy to pout as he waited for lunch to be ready. Within a few more minutes, Marco was walking back out of the kitchen, Thatch close behind, the both of them holding food for the brothers, which they set down in front of them. Thank you, commanders. Sabou thanked politely, Ace and Luffy already digging in. No problem. So, what have you three been up to? Anything interesting? Thatch asked, sitting across from them at the table, beside Izo. Nothing all that interesting, Sabou said simply, beginning to eat as well. Thatch sighed, nodding. Yeah, it's been a bit of a bore here in paradise. Maybe things will pick up soon, Thatch said wistfully, resting his head in his hand. Marco and Izo both rolled their eyes. You should be grateful for this moment of relaxation, Thatch. It means you've got no pape, Izo mumbled, still clearly concentrated more on the thing in his lap rather than the conversation. Thatch groaned. Yeah, but now there's just nothing to do, Thatch whined. There is lunch that you should be helping make, Marco said offhandedly as he sat at the table as well, having been standing before. Thatch shook his head but stood from the table now. A bunch of party poopers is what you two are. Thatch whined sadly as he began trudging away. Well, goodbye you three, maybe the next time I see you things will have picked up again, Thatch called, already disappearing back into the kitchen. Don't mind him, he can be overdramatic to put it lightly, Izo said to the brothers, sending them a small smile before returning to his task, whatever that was. "That's alright, we don't mind the theatrics," Sabou said, returning the smile. It was much easier to keep a conversation with the pirates when there was only a small group. Less overwhelming, less stressful. Sabou felt he had a lower chance of making anyone angry if only a few people were listening rather than tens and hundreds. "Well, that's good, Thatch is known for being theatrical," Izo said, pulling the thing in his lap a second before raising it, smiling brightly. "There, finished," he said, holding up a white glove that Sabou vaguely recognized. "Nice work as always, Izo, yoi," Marco complimented, examining the article. The brothers, though, were still confused. "Did you make it?" Sabou asked, the commander's attention turning to him at the question, making him a bit uncomfortable. Izo shook his head, placing the glove on the table. "No, I just mended it. It's Vista's glove actually, he ripped it so he asked me to fix it for him," Izo informed. Sabou glanced at the object, nodding. "You must be pretty good then, I can't even tell it was ripped in the first place," Sabou complimented. Izo beamed, looking pleased by the compliment. "Well, of course, I've had many years of practice, but I can do much more than just mending. I'm good at embroidering and even making clothes, like yours," Izo said, nodding to the clothes that they were wearing that day, ones that Izo had given them when they first got their room. Sabou raised an eyebrow, Ace and Luffy listening but not really following along. "Really? That's impressive," Sabou said, genuinely meaning it. Izo smiled to him again and the conversation died off there. It didn't take long for the brothers to finish their lunch and for them to be out of the galley right as the rest of the pirates on board began heading in for their own lunch. The brothers spent most of their time that afternoon exploring the ship again, Luffy enjoying the giant figurehead, Sabou and Ace having to keep him from jumping up onto it, knowing that the surface was slick from the ocean spray, and knowing Luffy he would fall in. By the time it was nearing dinner the three had explored the entire deck, deciding that tomorrow they might go explore the inside of the ship, and Sabou remembered they never did finish Izo's tour. The pirates were milling around the deck again, and Sabou recognized a few of the commanders that happened to be out as well. Whitebeard was even out now too, having been gone from the deck earlier. The brothers had decided that they were going to head to their room for a bit, maybe take a nap, but as they were descending the stairs from the upper deck a particularly strong gust of wind came and blew Luffy's hat off his head before he could grab it. "Hat!" Luffy cried, Ace and Sabou having to grab onto Luffy before he could fling himself after it. The straw hat had been blown over the railing, the brothers watching as it landed on the water, already beginning to float away from the Moby. "Ace, Sabou, my hat!" Luffy cried in dismay, and the brothers felt their hearts practically breaking. They knew that that hat was extremely important to Luffy, they knew that it was a major source of comfort for the boy, and without it, they knew Luffy wouldn't be nearly the same. "I wouldn't worry so much." Thatch's voice clued them in that others had noticed their brother's predicament. They turned to see that nearly everyone was now looking at them, Thatch, Marco, and Izo standing near them. "But my hat," Luffy said softly, watching the straw hat floating even further away now. He was barely containing his tears, wanting nothing more than to stretch his arm out and grab it, but knew that would only upset Ace and Sabou and get them into trouble. "It's okay Luffy, Nemours already going after it, yoi." At Marco's words, there was a splash in the water and the brothers could see the fish man swimming after the object, filling them with relief. "It's pretty important to you, huh?" Izo asked, Luffy nodding fast with a stern look on his face. He hummed, everyone watching as Nemours swam back, someone sending down the rope ladder for him. Luffy smiled widely, running up to the fish man with no regard to the fact that someone could hurt him in that moment. Ace and Sabou were shocked for a moment as they saw their brother from 7 years ago, smiling carefree, running up to strangers without worrying about possible consequences, but as fast as it had come, it was gone, the timid Luffy returning within seconds after taking the hat from Nemours. Thank you," Luffy said meekly, realizing he had run away from Ace and Sabou. He also noticed he was the center of attention at the moment and that did nothing to help the sudden anxiety welling inside him. "It was no problem Luffy," Nemours said kindly, smiling softly to the boy who gave him a small smile back, suddenly remembering what Sabou had taught him and bowing a bit before rushing back to his brother's sides, clinging the straw hat tightly in his hands. Sabou ruffled Luffy's hair, sending him happy feelings and praise, proud that he had remembered to bow, while Ace patted his back a bit, feeling the same as Sabou. "Hey Luffy, could I see your hat for a moment? I promise I'll give it right back," Izo said, and everyone could see the apprehension on Luffy's face as he looked from his hat, then back to Izo. After a few moments, Luffy handed the hat over a bit uneasily, even though Izo was smiling and only feeling calm feelings. Once the special object was in Izo's hands the brothers watched him carefully, ready to take the hat back if he started damaging it, but instead, Izo pulled a white string from his pocket, securing it to the hat. He placed it on Luffy's head, tying the string for him. "There, now you won't lose your hat anymore," Izo said, standing back and allowing the brothers to see it. Luffy beamed, holding the string in his fingers. "Wow, thanks, lady not lady," Luffy thanked happily, letting his nickname for the man slip out. Izo laughed at that. It was no problem, we wouldn't want you losing it anymore, Izo said, Luffy nodding in agreement. Nay, Ace, Sabou, look, now Hat can't fly away anymore, Luffy said happily, holding the string up to show his brothers. They both smiled to him, nodding. You're right Lu, that's pretty cool, Ace agreed, which only made Luffy beam even more. Thank you Izo, that was extremely kind of you, Sabou said, bowing to the commander and thanks, Luffy doing the same along with Ace. It was no problem, really, Izo said, waving of the gratitude. After that the brothers began walking back to their room, the pirates all returning to their usual activities. Peeved, Izo, I didn't know we could call you lady not lady. Thatch, I swear to Cammy, if you start calling me that you'll regret it. Multiple times throughout the night the brothers were woken up because Luffy would have a nightmare. Instead of having the one nightmare and then a peaceful sleep, the youngest had been plagued with them every time he closed his eyes, and no matter how hard he tried getting a restful sleep it didn't work. Ace and Sabou were definitely feeling the effects. Every time they woke up to Luffy's thrashing, or whimpering, or sometimes even screaming, they would feel tireder than the last time. By the time light was finally starting to shine in their room the three had given up on trying to fall back asleep, instead deciding to get up for the day despite the fact that none of them felt as if they had gotten any sleep. Today marked the second week since the three had escaped the facility, 2 whole weeks that they had been on the Whitebeard pirate's ship, and even though they made progress in terms of physical recovery, they had barely moved an inch when it came to mental recovery. The trio were sitting in bed, all with their eyes closed, yet not falling asleep, just trying to relax a bit before breakfast was ready. Sabou vaguely realized that he was starting to drift off again but couldn't find it in himself to care as his senses slowly began dulling, the haziness of sleep beginning to take over his mind, and he happily welcomed it. Only seconds after this though a noise caught his attention, and he shot up in bed, eyes wide with panic and breathing suddenly much faster than it had been before. The suddenness of Sabou's movements made Ace and Luffy jump up as well, thinking something was happening, but after a few seconds with Sabou saying nothing the blonde slowly began to calm down, slowly slumping back into the mattress. Sabou? Luffy asked softly, concerned as to what had just happened. He had felt the sheer terror coming from his older brother, which had unknowingly influenced him into feeling it as well, but now the blonde was calming down. That didn't explain what had happened though. Hey, you okay? Ace asked softly when Sabou didn't respond to Luffy. Finally, Sabou nodded, letting his eyes shut again. Yeah, I'm fine, just heard a rolling cart, Sabou muttered, and just like that Ace and Luffy understood. The two nodded, also lying back down to get a little bit of rest while they could. Luffy was terrified of falling asleep again, not wanting to have another nightmare, so he stared at the ceiling silently. When Sabou had been drifting off he hadn't been in the right state of mind, so when he heard a rolling cart that sounded just like the food cart in the facility he had panicked, his brain thinking he had to get his brothers up, get them ready for another day of testing. Eventually, the day started and Sabou informed them that they should leave for breakfast. Like yesterday all 3 of them were on edge, reverting back to how they had been their first day on the Moby, but instead of getting better after breakfast the unease stayed. Luffy was extremely timid, not wanting to move even an inch away from his brothers in fear that something would happen. All of the nightmares he had were replaying in his head, and even though he knew it was illogical for some of the dreams to happen, that didn't make him any less scared of them. Ace was also even more on guard, spinning to see every minute movement. He knew it was bad when a fly buzzed by and he nearly flamed his fist up to attack it as if it were a weapon. Sabou wasn't any better than the other two, using his hearing to listen to anything and everything, paranoid that someone was going to somehow sneak up on them even though it was nearly impossible to with how guarded and tense the 3 were. The lack of sleep that night wasn't doing any of them any favors, and it seemed the Whitebeard pirates knew something was up. It wasn't hard to figure out with how twitchy and jumpy the 3 were throughout breakfast, but no one knew what to do, not wanting to upset the brothers. Some suggested getting a nurse, but that was ultimately decided to end up doing more harm than good, so instead, they decided to give the 3 a bit of space. It was conflicting for the brothers because more than anything they wanted to be left alone, but at the same time they didn't want to go back to their room where they would be confined in such a small space. They were exhausted, but they needed, the fresh air, the feeling of being able to move around. In the end, the brothers ended up going to their usual spot at the railing, assuming their normal positions and trying to relax. Of course, the key word there was trying. Even as they forced themselves to enjoy the view of the ocean, or being able to lay down in Ace's case, they were still buzzing with nervous energy, feeling as if any second something was going to happen. Within a few minutes Ace was falling victim to another sleep attack, and that did nothing to help Sabou and Luffy relax, the 3 even more wired than before as they focused on making sure no one got too close to them or Ace. Sabou was aware of the fact that Ace's sleep attacks were getting worse, this being the 3rd day in a row in which he'd had one, but he also knew that it was because of the lack of sleep and the high emotional state he'd been in recently. Sadly, it didn't seem like things were going to get any better. If Luffy's nightmares continued this way none of them would get any sleep, and the fact that they were going to be on the Moby for a while surrounded by possibly murderous pirates wasn't going to help Ace calm down from his overly stressed state anytime soon either. Eventually, Ace was waking back up, dazed and confused as he tried to figure out where he was and what was happening. Sabou calmed him down before he did anything too drastic, telling him where they were and that he had fallen asleep. Unlike yesterday, it seemed the sky was finally beginning to see a change in weather as Sabou could see dark clouds on the horizon, and Sabou couldn't help but snort at how fitting it was for this to be the day where it finally gets stormy. His brothers gave him questioning looks, but he ignored them, watching the ocean again. More and more time passed, though not nearly as fast as the brothers would have liked. Unlike usual, where they would at least communicate with each other through their silent language, today they weren't saying anything to one another, but that was okay. None of them were up for conversation, instead wanting to mull over their own anxieties alone. But even that came to an end when one pirate came running out from below deck. Any other time the brothers would have glanced at him, noticed he wasn't running towards them, or even in their general direction, and went back to what they were doing, but this time was different. "Nay, Haruda, guess what?" The brothers froze at the name, and with their already high stress and anxiety, the sound of that Mont's name at the beginning of the commander's name tipped them just over the edge. Most of the pirates had noticed that, around the brothers, Haruda was called Ruda, but apparently that pirate hadn't gotten the memo. Now there were many eyes on them, everyone wondering how the trio would react to the name. Much like the first time they had heard it, they were frozen, lost in their own memories of the facility. Luffy was beginning to shake and Ace was so tense it was beginning to hurt, while Sabou was gripping the railing so tight he was afraid it was going to snap beneath him. No words were spoken. Ace merely stood up, grabbed Luffy's hand, pulled him off the railing, and walked away, Sabou close behind. They were walking in such a zombified manner that it stunned some pirates, watching as the three disappeared below deck. It had gone silent, no one wanting to speak, but the sound of the door shutting shocked them out of their stupor. "Ah, I forgot it was Ruda now. Today was definitely not the day for this." Ace was still trying to shake himself out of the memories of the facility, annoyed that this was even happening at all. He was out of there, this shouldn't be hot, nothing to worry about, it's not like those people could come get him right now. But they could. These pirates had seen the facility, had defeated the doctors. What if it was all a show? What if they contacted the doctors and one day they would wake up right back in their cell again? But it had been 2 weeks now, why would the pirates wait that long? Maybe the facility was rebuilding itself and would come get the brothers when it was ready. No matter how outlandish the idea was, Ace's brain managed to rationalize it enough that he believed it, became paranoid that the possibilities would come true, that, one day, they would see Haru's ugly face again. Sabou and Luffy weren't any better than he was, Sabou thinking the exact same thoughts as Ace, wondering if this was all some elaborate trick, that the pirates really would betray them and send them back. There was no way of knowing for sure, no way of knowing that they wouldn't send them back once they realized the brothers were too difficult to take care of. Luffy was even worse though, still shaking from having heard Haruda's name. The triggering word had sent him into a pit of thoughts and memories that he couldn't climb out of. He was suddenly remembering his every moment in the facility, how painful every shot was, every cut, every test, how cold the cells were, how gross and slimy the doctor's feelings were. He was even remembering his nightmares from last night, things that hadn't happened but had seemed so real that Luffy didn't know if they were repressed memories or something his brain made up to scare him. Had they done that test to see if he could regrow limbs, or had that been a figment of his imagination? Could he really jump super high because of a painful stimulant they had put into his legs, or was that fake too? It was getting difficult for Luffy to differentiate his nightmares from his memories. None of the brothers could snap out of it. They were stuck in their own heads, stuck back in a facility that they had escaped from. They didn't know how long they sat there in their room, stuck, but when the ship suddenly started violently rocking, it was enough to sober up Sabou, the blonde looking around in dazed confusion. He could hear a commotion outside along with a loud patter of something on the deck. Oh, it was storming. Apparently, those dark storm clouds he had seen earlier had finally reached the Moby, and now the pirates were fighting their way through it. He could hear some commanders ordering others on what to do so they could get out safely and use that to ground himself. He wasn't at the facility, he was on the Moby. Sure, these pirates could betray them, send them back, but right now they weren't, and if they did, they would deal with it then. They wouldn't go back, they would do everything in their power to not go back. Besides, now they had Garp and Shanks on their sides, they would help them if they were taken again. Slowly returning back to reality, Sabou noticed that Ace and Luffy were most definitely not in the same reality as him. It took a bit of coaxing, but he had eventually gotten Ace out of his trance, the two of them working together to get Luffy out of it, who was much further gone than they had been. It took a bit of time and a lot of effort, but they did it, the three of them listening to the crashing waves and pelting rain outside. Ace and Luffy were even able to hear some of the pirates shouting too. The three laid on the bed, trying to relax a bit. "Today's been a shitty day," Ace muttered, Luffy and Sabou nodding in agreement. "We just didn't get enough sleep. It messed us up," Sabou said with a sigh. Sorry, Luffy mumbled meekly, Ace and Sabo sending him warm feelings at how small his voice sounded. It's fine Lu, it's not your fault, Ace said, Sabo nodding in agreement. Luffy pouted. But I kept waking you guys up, so it is my fault, Luffy said, feeling bad that he had woken his brothers up so many times throughout the night. He wasn't a kid, he should be able to get over his own nightmares, but he couldn't. But you can't control what dreams you have, can you? Sabo asked, Luffy shaking his head no. See, so it wasn't your fault. Everyone has nightmares and after everything we've been through we just get them much easier and more often than normal people. That's all. Sabo said, cheering Luffy up a bit. Now, speaking of sleep, why don't we try to take a nap? It was now much later in the day, almost time for dinner, lunch having come and gone. The commanders were all in a meeting with Whitebeard, discussing their next course of action. When they had found the brothers at the facility they had been restocking after having helped one of their islands, but now they needed to get back to the new world before the Marines got too twitchy about them being in the calmer waters. It was agreed that they would land at one more island before Sabou so that they could restock again, as well as get the necessary items for the brothers. I made them enough clothes for a week, so they must have already gone through everything by now. I don't have any more fabric to make more clothes so that should definitely be top priority in terms of things they need. Izo said, everyone, nodding in understanding while Marco wrote things down, putting that at the top of the brothers' list. And Ace and Luffy eat a lot more than anyone else. We'll have to up our food budget to accommodate that, Thatch added, eliciting more nods from the group. Other than that we should restock the med bay. After helping all those kids from the facility we're starting to run low on supplies. Flamenco finished. The meeting had been long, but that was normal, especially when they were making lists for restocking. Now that everything was done the commanders began relaxing, chatting about the day they'd had. Did you notice how tense the brothers were today? At Rikuyo's question all attention turned to him. Everyone suddenly invested in the topic. Yeah, how could you not? They looked ready to bolt the entire day, Haruta said, though there was worry laced in his tone as he remembered how on edge the trio had been all day. I wouldn't say bolt. Remember when Jack said your name Haruta? They walked off like they were sleepwalking, Atmos said, many nodding as they remembered. Their reaction to your name was much stronger today than it had been before, Namur noted, remembering back to the first time the three had heard it. They must have been having a bad day today, Yoi, Marco said, still writing things down on his list. Yes, those three did look troubled the entire day today. Whitebeard agreed, having been keeping a closer eye on the brothers today, worried about them with how they had been acting, almost as if they were cornered animals getting ready to snap. After the Haruta incident though the brothers had stayed holed up in their room, not even coming out for lunch. Of course, this worried everyone even more, but when the platter of food that Thatch had left outside their door ended up empty the captain decided not to send the nurses after them, rather let them stay in their room for the time being. Obviously, they needed the solitude, a place where they wouldn't be disturbed, and if he sent the nurses after them, even with good intentions, that would only make it worse. The brothers, like every other child they had saved from the facility, had an obvious disliking towards the nurses and needles, and if they were having a bad day because of the things that had happened in the facility, nurses were the last thing they needed. Whitebeard sighed, watching as his children began talking amongst themselves once more. He hoped that one day the three would open up, be comfortable enough that they could act like normal children without worry. He knew that it wouldn't happen overnight, that it would be a long time coming, but if they continued to help the brothers he hoped that they would see that they weren't going to hurt them, that they didn't want them to be scared of them. Everyone on the Mobi was family, and T exception, many already thinking of them as brothers even though they weren't officially a part of the crew. Family helps each other get over trauma, and that's what they were going to do for the brothers. They wouldn't push them, they'll let them open up on their own, but they weren't going to shy away from them either. They were going to show those three that not everyone in this world was a bad person. Now they just had to hope that tomorrow was a better day than today had been.